Could the Jets make a trade for a quarterback? We'll discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, October 11th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangrenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you're listening on a podcast source and enjoy the show, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help us out, help other Jets fans find the show. Today's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jase case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jasemedical.com. That's Jase medical.com. Today we have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday we try and do a show with listener questions. I answer them. Let's begin. Our first question is about the quarterback position. We could make a serious run after the bye if we get competent quarterback play, but I am not sold on Zach. Are there any quarterbacks you think might be available at or before the trade deadline that might be worth making a run at if he disappoints on Sunday? Well, it's kind of a catch-22 because I don't think the Jets are going to be able to win if Zach Wilson disappoints on Sunday. This is not a team in the Philadelphia Eagles that the Jets are going to be able to skate by the way maybe they did against the Denver Broncos. I don't think Denver played a particularly great game this past Sunday, but the Jets were able to win because Denver is one of the worst teams in the NFL. You are now going from one of the worst teams in the NFL to one of the best and arguably the best in the Philadelphia Eagles. So I think it's going to need a quality performance from Zach Wilson to get a victory in this one. So it's a tough call because if you fall to 2-4, now I've said the Jets are still alive at 2-4, but that, being alive at 2-4 is a little bit different from feeling like your chances are very good. If the Jets lose on Sunday, look, the odds will be against them. The team just won't be finished. I think if the team had started 1-5, they'd be completely finished. We'd be talking about draft position. At 2-4, I think you still have to acknowledge that your odds are not great. Now, look, the obvious candidate, the guy who's constantly being mentioned is Kirk Cousins out in Minnesota. And of course, there's history between Kirk Cousins and the Jets. If you're not familiar with it, back in 2018, he was a free agent. He left Washington, and the two bidders were the Jets and Minnesota. And it seems like, in retrospect, based on some of the things that have come out since then, Cousins was never really that interested in the Jets. In fact, there were reports the Jets actually offered him more money than Minnesota, but it sounds like Cousins kind of used the Jets as leverage to try and get the Vikings to increase their bid. Now, outside of Woody Johnson, who even Woody Johnson wasn't really here because he was the ambassador to the UK at that time, nobody from the Jets is really around from that point, or at least none of the key decision makers are still around from that point. So I don't know if there's any real bad blood there. I think the question is whether Minnesota would actually trade Kirk Cousins, because you can do a lot worse than Kirk Cousins. I mean, what's Minnesota going to do at quarterback going forward? I'm not saying Cousins necessarily stays, but I'm not sure Minnesota is going to be willing to trade him in season without a plan. But he's the logical candidate because if you actually look at his contract, it's pretty reasonable. His base salary this year is only about $10 million. And you have to remember, about a quarter of that's already paid. So it'd be, about $7.5 million left to pay because he's already been paid, for the games he's played already. So that comes off his future cap hit. And there's not really anything else because he's a free agent after the season. So if you're looking for a quarterback who's a rental, who you're not going to have any complications next year when Aaron Rodgers comes back, well, Cousins is about to hit free agency. And not only that, I mean, if you let him go, you're probably looking at a high compensatory pick in return. So you could even make the case, trade a 3rd or a 4th round pick for Cousins and then play the comp pick game. And if you do that, then you'll essentially get him, just for whatever it costs monetarily, because if you trade like a 3rd or a 4th round pick, you could let him walk in free agency and then get a 3rd or 4th round comp pick in return. I guess if there's an option, that would be the one. I still think there are some complications though with this. I think that, first of all, is Minnesota going to want to trade him? Second of all, I don't get the feeling, and this could change quickly, I don't get the feeling the Jets are ready to move on from Zach Wilson right now. Now, bad game Sunday, maybe that's different, but it feels like the at least in the locker room, the feeling around Zach is a lot better than it was a year ago. A year ago, I mean, the way the team reacted to Zach Wilson, I don't think I've ever seen a team so publicly quit on a quarterback the way the Jets did a year ago with Zach Wilson. This year, at least on the surface, it seems like everybody's behind him at this point. And while that could change, it's tough to say. I think that there are lots of complications, though, to making a trade in season for a quarterback work. I think that maybe we overstate the difficulty it will take in learning a new system, because systems across the NFL aren't that different from each other. You're all running the same plays, and really learning a new system, the biggest obstacle is the terminology of what a play is called. What's the play called in this playbook versus what's the play called in that playbook. But even then, a lot of these coaches have very similar play calls, have similar terminology, so you can pick it up relatively quickly. I mean, I think he's the guy, but I would still guess there's not going to be a trade anywhere. And I don't even know that there's another option right now that would give you a better chance than Zach Wilson or even Trevor Siemian. I think the big obstacle is quarterbacks are perhaps the most difficult commodity to find in the NFL. So if you got one, why would you trade him? Why would you give up? Even if you have a good backup, you're one snap away from needing your backup to win you games. I mean, you watch the Jets what happened with Aaron Rodgers. I think if I'm another team, I'm saying that could be me. My starting quarterback could go down. I better make sure I hold on to my good backup. I think it's unlikely. I think if there is a guy, there's starting to become some buzz around Kirk Cousins. So despite his history with the Jets, I think he probably would be the guy. It's difficult to say, though. Next question, John. With the downward turn for Hardman on the team, do you think they may bring up Brownlee from the practice squad? It seems Wilson and Lazard are the only receivers making a contribution. Maybe Brownlee comes in with 3 receiver sets on the outside, or moves Wilson or Lazard into the slot for a better matchup. I don't understand why they aren't playing Hardman. And this is amazing for me to say, because I was a huge skeptic of this signing. Like, I did not like this signing all that much. But geez, he got to be better than what you're getting from Randall Cobb. I don't understand why they're so willing to move on from him right now without at least giving him a chance to show what he can do. Because for all of his shortcomings, I mean, these are the things he can add that nobody else can on the roster. He's got speed, so you at least have to respect his ability to run deep routes. And he can, even if he's kind of a decoy, he can at least clear out the safety and create more space for guys underneath. And he also has some degree of ability to make plays with the ball in his hand. So you can, manufacture touches for him in space, try and get him going that way. I mean, I don't know that Brownlee's going to come from the practice squad and be that great. Although I will say this, I think look, Randall Cobb's probably going to start producing more, just because it's impossible in the NFL to play as much as Randall Cobb has played and produce this little. I mean, he's got to get better just by the law of averages, because even though he's not a productive player, even though he's not helping anybody, there's no way he can be this bad going forward. So Cobb's going to start producing a little bit more, but I don't see what the point of having him on the field is. I mean, the only semi-coherent argument for having Cobb on this team this year was the chemistry he had with Aaron Rodgers. And even that, I think, was an enormous stretch, because Randall Cobb really has nothing left to offer as a player. You can bring guys up on the practice squad. In fact, earlier this week, Irv Charles was promoted back from the practice squad to the active roster after the play he made in special teams Sunday against Denver. But before I did anything with another receiver, I'd give Hardman a chance, because even if his production hasn't been spectacular, he does at least have a history of producing to some degree in the NFL. I don't get it. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the offensive line. Joe Douglas's work there, it's kind of controversial. Has it been bad luck? Has it been bad moves by Joe Douglas? A little bit of both. I'll tell you what I think, continuing this Wednesday mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by eBay Motors. Our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week all season long. Whether you're prepping for a daily draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you with players who are guaranteed to fit on your roster. So let's see who Vinny has picked out for us on this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. Baker Mayfield, to the surprise of many, has been a borderline QB1 in fantasy while enjoying his most efficient season as a reality passer. Coming off a Buccaneers Week 5 bye, he should need to pass for high volume in a matchup against Jared Goff and the red-hot Lions at home in Week 6. Mayfield has been locked on to a variety of receivers, and the Lions can struggle to cover slot target Chris Godwin and tight end Cade Otton. The Bucs also won't be able to run as much on Detroit, leading to passing digits from Mayfield. Vinny Iyer from Locked On Fantasy Football is going to help you win your fantasy championship. And eBay Motors knows a championship team is all about each player being a perfect fit. The same goes for your vehicle. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof rack, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers, eligible items only, exclusions apply. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and then bonus episodes as needed. We continue with our weekly mailbag. Next question. Under Mike Maccagnan, we saw what a bad job of building an offensive line looks like. Do you think Joe Douglas is doing a bad job also? And do you think he'll continue to struggle? Or do you think that the poor performance is more attributable to factors beyond his control? And if he gets another couple of years, that will level out and we will see the quality of the offensive line get closer to what we're seeing on the defensive line. So the question is, has Joe Douglas had bad luck on the offensive line, or has Joe Douglas done a bad job? I think the answer is a little bit of both. Now, Mike Maccagnan was mentioned. The thing with Mike Maccagnan was he kind of viewed the offensive line as an afterthought. He did not invest big resources up front. It's one of the most baffling things how an NFL general manager could feel like the offensive line was not an important component of a football team. But I mean, he had a lot of reclamation projects from Ryan Clady to Kelvin Beachum at left tackle, even though Beachum kind of worked. I mean, he invested some mid-round picks in some guys. Brandon Shell was kind of a hit. And then a couple free agent moves. But Mike Maccagnan did not really seem to care about the offensive line. He kind of viewed it as a spot where you could save money, where you could save resources. It was one of the more baffling things I've ever seen. Joe Douglas clearly cares about the offensive line. I mean, look at the resources he's invested. He's invested 2 first-round picks in 4 drafts. He's invested a second-round pick. He's made priority free agent signings there. His moves just haven't been very good. And there's been some bad luck, of course. You look at Mekhi Becton. I mean, Mekhi Becton is actually a good example of the Joe Douglas experience on offensive line, because I think Mekhi Becton's an example of both bad evaluation and bad luck. I think when we talk about the evaluation, he's been injured. So look, that factors in. As a rookie, he beat expectations. But I think sometimes we say, like, I'm not expecting much from this guy. He was better than I expected as a rookie. That's different from saying he looked like a franchise left tackle. It was up and down for him. And I think that if we're being objective, even if he had stayed healthy, based on what I saw his rookie year, based on what I've seen this year, I think it's very difficult to say that he would be better than Tristan Wirfs, who is a player Joe Douglas passed on. So, and this has been kind of an ongoing theme with Joe Douglas. Joe Douglas values traits, physical attributes, physical skills, strength, big frame, athleticism. He values that over anything else. He values that over, understanding the nuances of your position. And that's a philosophical thing. It's not that one's necessarily good or the opposite's necessarily bad. Joe Douglas got that from Ozzie Newsome, and Ozzie Newsome took that approach over the course of over a decade in Baltimore, and was one of the best talent evaluators in the NFL. So that approach can work. I just don't think Joe Douglas has done a great job with that approach, especially on the offensive line. Now, of course, Becton, there's also been bad luck, though. I mean, how can you predict that the guy's going to suffer serious knee injuries back-to-back years? You can't. Elijah Vera Tucker is another good example. He's a good player. I don't think that's necessarily a failed pick. There's bad luck there. But I think it's also fair to look back on that trade up Joe Douglas made in 2021, because the Jets traded with the Minnesota Vikings. So they gave Minnesota their lower first-round pick and 2 third-round picks. And with that lower first-round pick, the Vikings drafted Christian Darrisaw, who, if Elijah Vera Tucker's been good, I think Darrisaw has been more valuable for Minnesota than AVT has been for the Jets. So even AVT was not a bad move trading up, not necessarily, but I still think you look at it, Minnesota had the lower pick and probably got the better player, even if AVT stays healthy. And they got 2 third-round picks in addition to that. So it's one of those things where, you can make a case either way. But I think if you had the option, would you do that trade up over? I think you'd probably stay where you were, take Darrisaw, and keep the extra third-round picks, because you're probably getting a better player and you're keeping 2 additional third-round picks. AVT, there's, again, bad luck. I mean, how could you predict a triceps injury and then a torn Achilles? You can't. But that's part of the gamble when you trade up in that spot. And if you go back to what I said on draft night in 2021, when the Jets traded up for AVT, what it told me was that AVT was like the last elite lineman on the board for the Jets. that proved, I think that proved to be a shaky evaluation because Darrisaw was there. Minnesota got him, and I think he's been better. So you look at the signings up front. Connor McGovern's been a pretty good signing, but Megan Tomlinson's been a bad signing. George Fant, I think there was more bad than good. Fant had like the one good year in 2021, but I think 2 of the 3 years were not very good. You look at what they did this year. I mean, I think going into the season with Dwayne Brown and Becton with no real plan B, that was a bad plan. I think at the end of the day, it's been bad luck. It's been bad execution by Joe Douglas. He hasn't been as bad as Maccagnan. I mean, look, I'd rather have a guy with a good plan who just executes it poorly than a guy with a bad plan. Maccagnan had a bad plan. Joe Douglas has the good plan that's been poorly executed. But that said, I mean, I don't think Douglas has done a very good job on the offensive line. And I think that it's the big reason this is the weakness. Sometimes, and listen, he's had some bad fortune along the way, but he's also made some moves that you can look back on and say, I don't know that was necessarily the best thing he could have done there. Next question is from Pat. John, it feels like every week the Jets are getting called on a roughing the passer penalty. Some of the calls I agree with, but many of them have been borderline at best. But that's not really the true problem. The problem rests in the fact the Jets have not had a roughing the passer call in their favor since December 19th, 2021. I find that statistically impossible. During that time, the Jets have been called for almost 40. Am I wrong for being frustrated by this? No, you're not wrong for being frustrated by this. In fact, on Sunday, I mean, early in that game, if you saw, it was a blatantly blown call that, a guy, Nick Benito, hit Zach Wilson in the head, which should be an automatic roughing the passer call that the officials did not throw a flag on. So you're not wrong for being angry over this. I think where I lose the thread on this is when people act like there's a conspiracy against the Jets in the league office, like the league's conspiring to have bad calls go against the Jets, because those people like always ignore when a call goes in the Jets' favor. They're bad calls are rampant through the league. I think part of the issue is that, the players are just so big and fast these days that it's difficult for the officials in the NFL to keep up with what's going on. So I don't think you're wrong about it. I think the Jets have really been the recipient of a lot of bad calls when we talk about roughing the passer on both sides of the ball. I don't think that's a sign that the league's out to get the Jets, though. First of all, there are lots of calls that go the Jets' way, and nobody ever talks about that. But second is, I think you need to understand, and this is something the league will never admit, but you need to understand why roughing the passer is called the way it is in the NFL. And again, the NFL will never admit to this, but there's a real reason the NFL calls roughing the passer the way it does. They're trying to protect the star quarterbacks. Because, you hear a lot of fans complain, it's like touch football these days. You can't hit anybody. But these are the same people who will complain if, like, you get to a playoff game and you have 2 backup quarterbacks in there. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to keep the star quarterbacks alive. They're trying to keep the star quarterbacks from getting hurt. And that's the reason they're so strict with these roughing the passer calls. So teams with star quarterbacks benefit from this. I guarantee you, if Aaron Rodgers was playing, the Jets would have had a roughing the passer call in their favor. They would have had multiple ones. A lot of the hits Zach Wilson's taken would be roughing the passer calls with Aaron Rodgers. And the NFL will never admit that, but it's true. And because the Jets have Zach Wilson right now, I think that's the reason they're not getting the calls. Is that fair? No. Should you be upset with that? Sure. But I think that's it. I think that's the reason. I think that they're much more willing to throw flags on hits on star quarterbacks, and that's really the reason. That's the big reason the Jets haven't gotten those calls. And you're right to be upset about that, because they should call the game fairly. I don't think it's like the NFL's out to get the Jets. I think, again, if Aaron Rodgers was here, you'd be seeing a very different thing play out, because it makes no sense for the NFL to conspire against the team in its biggest market. But the teams that have the Zach Wilsons, they aren't going to get the calls the teams like the Aaron Rodgerses get. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll close out this mailbag show. We're going to talk about Robert Saleh. Is he doing a good job? What are some of the issues with him? We'll talk about it continuing this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Jase Medical. Everybody should be empowered to take care of for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected. That's why Jase Medical offers the Jase case. The Jase case provides 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use and gives you peace of mind so that you're not just hoping you'll have access to medication in an emergency. Jase Medical makes sure you have the medication in hand. Jase Medical is simple. They handle everything from the online evaluation to licensed pharmacy medication delivery and ongoing consultation and care. Don't get caught unprepared. Get $20 off these life-saving antibiotics today from Jase Medical by using the code LOCKEDON at checkout on jasemedical.com. That's code LOCKEDON, LOCKEDON, one word, at Jase, Jase, medical.com. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Wednesday mailbag show. Our next question. John, do you think Robert Saleh is a better coach than Todd Bowles? I see a lot of similarities between the two in terms of their conservative approach. And if you've been listening to me since training camp, since the preseason, I've been pretty open about this that, I was the first 2 years I was very wait and see on Robert Saleh. I really have a lot of questions about him right now. I think that there are a lot of things I don't like, and one of them is the conservative approach that we saw in this offense on Sunday. And I know the Jets won the game, and I know they put up 400 yards of offense, and I know that they had some scoring drives in the second half, but I thought they were way too conservative. I thought that their approach, essentially, running the ball like almost every first and second down, really limited their ability to make big plays because Denver was pretty easily able to prevent the big. Breece Hall had that 72-yard run, but if a team's going to run it every time, it's much easier to shut down the big play. I mean, maybe you can grind out a 5-6 yard run, but it's harder to break those long runs if the other team's keying on the run consistently because they know there's no threat of the pass. And it's also really tough to matriculate the ball down the field, so they say, if it requires 12 plays to get it into the end zone, because you need guys to execute at a high level every single play. You got to throw in some chunk plays here or there. And I don't think the Jets did a particularly good job of that. I mean, the two big plays that they made were the one time they had to throw it, and Zach hit Tyler Conklin for the 38-yard gain. And then there was one big play where they actually went to play action and Zach threw the ball down the field. And the reason that I'm saying this is the Jets were settling for field goals in the second half of that game Sunday when a touchdown would have put it away. That game never should have gotten to a point where Denver had the ball with the chance to win it in the final 2 minutes. And that's where the Jets ended up because of how conservative their approach was. So, I have a lot of issues with the way Saleh has run this team. In fact, in the summer, I mentioned 3 issues I had. One is that I was concerned with the quality of his assistant hires, and Nathaniel Hackett's done nothing to remedy that concern. I think out of the 5 games, the only game where I liked his game plan was Kansas City. That was the only time where I felt like he had a good approach to the game. And I can even give him a pass for the Buffalo game because Rodgers went down 4 plays in and they kind of had to scrap what they were doing. But outside of that, I mean, I think that Hackett's been a shaky hire. And I understand Hackett's here in no small part because he was the guy that was supposed to help them get Aaron Rodgers. But that wasn't the only reason. Hackett and Saleh go way back. And I think Saleh hired one of his friends. And I don't think it's really working out that well for the Jets. Another issue that I had in the summer, which I think has been a little bit better, is I was concerned that they had a lot of young players. Last year there were lots of issues with young players who, just weren't connecting with the coaching staff. I do think that's gotten better. And of the areas where Hackett, I think, is doing a good job, I think that's one of them. I actually think I don't like most of what Hackett's doing. I think his play design's not good. I think his play calling's not good. I think his game planning's not good. I don't think he utilizes the right talent. I don't think the players he puts on the field are very smart. I don't think he's very smart in terms of how he utilizes his players. I do think he's good at connecting with players. I think he's good at getting guys to buy in. So that, I think, is a positive of the issues that I had with Saleh. But overall, I've got a lot of concerns. I mean, there are lots of guys who are very good coordinators and not great head coaches. And at this point in time, I wonder whether Saleh is one of them. Now, I think you talk about Bowles, and again, the jury's out whether Saleh is ultimately better than Bowles. One area where Saleh does remind me of Bowles is dealing with the media. And it's something that should not matter. But I think the message you put out to your fan base, it influences people. And I think much like Bowles, Saleh has not mastered the art of coach speak, because there's a way you can frame things that is very uncontroversial, yet it sounds like you know what you're talking about. I'll give you an example. After the disaster New England game Zach Wilson had, Saleh gets in front of the media and says, Zach Wilson's not the reason we lost this game. Zach Wilson's getting better, which was ridiculous. And when you say something like that, now Saleh knows Zach Wilson Saleh absolutely knows Zach Wilson was the reason the Jets lost that game against New England. And he knows that he's lying. He knows Zach Wilson was not getting better after that game against New England. But he doesn't want to throw Zach Wilson under the bus. So he goes out and says that, and he sounds completely disconnected. So fans say this guy has no idea what's going on his team. Whereas a more reasonable way to answer that, the coach speak way to kind of take the air out of the ball would be something like, look, Zach would be the first one to tell you he's got to play better than that. But something, as a coaching staff, we got to do better. We got to put him in better positions. You say something non-controversial, it sounds reasonable. You're not throwing your quarterback in. But Zach, I could give you a million examples of Saleh doing that, where he just sounds totally disengaged. And I think that's part of his problem, is that the perception is that he doesn't know what's going on with his team sometimes, because he just doesn't use coach speak properly. Ultimately, though, I agree with you. I'm concerned about the conservative approach. I'm happy to change my opinion as as events dictate. Listen, I change my opinion on players all the time. Quincy Williams last year I thought was just an okay guy. This year I think he's a star. So if the performance improves by Saleh, I'll be happy to say that. But right now, I agree with you. I have some concerns about Saleh. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.